Good afternoon, and if you're just now joining us, welcome to the 4th annual Teach-In at the University of Oklahoma. What a day we've had so far. Have we had 3 tremendous talks so far, or what? Amazing. I'm so grateful to all of you for being here, for braving this weather, although having just listened to Tim Egan talk about what we've got in our Oklahoma heritage, braving a little bit of rain isn't too tough. Now, what I do love is being at a university where you have traffic jams because of history-themed events. That's a great university. The Teach-In has really become a special part of the OU culture, an annual spring event where the entire community comes together. And I'm so grateful to all the people who make this extraordinary day possible, starting with all of you who are in the audience today. There's so many of you who support our programs in so many different ways, and it makes it possible for us to make the University of Oklahoma a center for the study of American history, constitutional history, to make it a place where civic education really is fundamental to our mission. So thank you to everyone in this audience who supports our programs, who supports our institute in so many different ways. I also am so grateful to the amazing colleagues that I have in the institute, to the amazing staff that we have, to the amazing staff at Public Affairs who work so hard. It really takes a village to make an event of this scale possible, and they do an amazing job to make the Teach-In such a success year after year. And the Teach-In, of course, wouldn't be possible without the leadership of President and Mrs. Boren. Their vision for what a public university is and still remember so vividly and fondly the day when I got a phone call from the president who had an idea for a Teach-In. I had to look up what a Teach-In was. But we have now redefined what a Teach-In is, and this day, I think, more than any other, symbolizes what this university is about, what a public university should be about, what civic education can be. I'm very proud to work for you. Your leadership, your moral leadership, has made this university one of the great public universities anywhere. Thank you. We've had a great set of talks so far, and the afternoon promises to be just as special. I hope you're able to stay for both the 2 o'clock talk and the 3 o'clock talk, as well as a very interesting 4 o'clock panel that we'll have featuring all of our distinguished speakers. But it's now my pleasure to introduce and give the microphone over to one of our very special guests today, Peter Kastor. He's a historian who specializes in the politics and culture of the early American Republic. He's an exceptional author. He's the editor and author of 6 different books, including most recently William Clark's World, Describing America in an Age of Unknowns. He's a wonderful writer, written a number of brilliant essays. He also has a special connection to OU and to the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage. My senior associate director, Kevin Butterfield, was a graduate, or got his PhD at Washington University in St. Louis, and Peter served on his thesis, his dissertation committee. So it's wonderful to see the networks of learning and knowledge that span across the country, and we really have benefited from his expertise in ways you might not have known about by having Kevin on our faculty. He is a professor of history and American cultural studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Please give him a warm Oklahoma welcome, Professor Peter Kastor.
All right, good afternoon. Now, the microphone is working. Can everybody hear me? In the back, can you hear me? In the front, you can't hear me in the front. All right, so I'm going to speak up. Whoa. I'm going to speak up. I'm working from a lapel mic. Oh, you see? I know. So I'm going to speak up. That was a warm Oklahoma welcome. I wondered what an Oklahoma welcome was, and now I know. So I come here from Missouri. We're right across the border, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be back in Oklahoma. I was here last year to participate in an NEH institute that was being run at the university. It's delightful to be back, and I'm very grateful to Provost Harper for that introduction, and especially to President Boren for his invitation to be here today. I want to join in saying that this is an absolutely wonderful event. When I go back to Missouri, I'm going to say in Oklahoma, people come from far and wide to hear about history, and it's time for Missouri to do the same. It's also been an absolute pleasure to meet some of the undergraduates here. When I was visiting last summer, I got to meet various faculty members, but I didn't get to meet any undergraduates because it was the summer and they weren't here. And I've just been absolutely delighted and amazed by the talents and the ability of the undergraduates here. And so it's really just been a pleasure to be here. Now, one thing I was thinking about as I was trying to decide what I would discuss today, I looked at the range of other presenters. And these include people who I have admired for years. And I thought, what am I going to talk about? I've been reading their work. How do I do something a little different? And then the answer came to me, actually, when I looked at this logo, and I looked at the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage. And I thought, well, is there some way to talk about the Constitution, the United States Constitution, and to connect it to not just the theme of frontiers, which frames the teach-in this year, but also to the West in general. And I thought, well, that might be an interesting way to do things. More specifically, I wanted to talk about politics and constitutions, but I want to do this in a way that would talk about politics in the West without it being about the politics in the West that Westerners usually hear about. So today, when I talk mostly about the 19th century, for example, I'm not going to be talking about frontier democracy. I'm not going to be talking about boomers and Sooners. I am especially not going to be talking about Democrats and Republicans, because that's just going to get me into trouble no matter where I go. So what does that leave me? That leaves me with the U.S. Constitution, and it leaves me with governance. And indeed, an emerging theme today seems to be the love of bureaucratic study, because in the same way Patty Limerick was talking about her own interest with organizations, with bureaucrats, I share much of that. And indeed, today I want to talk about governance on the frontiers of North America. More specifically, governance on the frontiers of the United States. And to begin that, I want to ask you a question, you Oklahomans. Why do you think you are entitled to representation in Congress? We take it for granted. We take that for granted in Missouri, which is not the state I grew up in, but the state I live in now. We assume that those states are entitled to representation in Congress. It would be unnatural for there to be anything else. But the reason that those states have representation in Congress, the reason they are states at all, is because of the territorial system. And that's what I want to talk about today. The territorial system on the frontiers of North America, the territorial system specifically in the West. And I want to do this because it is the territorial system that created the federal system as we know it. It's the territorial system that defined the contours of federal governance, that established what the federal government would actually do. It became the foundational experience for immensely important public figures. 32 states in the Union began their lives as territories. Sorry, Texas. And that's our other recurring theme. Let's pick on Texas. Or let's put it another way. Sorry, Pennsylvania, because that's where I grew up. And I grew up with this story that American history begins and radiates from a tale of how colonies in the East declared their independence and established what it would mean to be American. Today, I want to tell a very different story. I want to talk about how territories in the West established their independence under the U.S. Constitution, and they defined what it would mean to be American. It was the territorial system that revealed both the extent and the limitations of the Constitution, and I think we take it for granted at our own risk. And that may seem odd. If you are like my students in Missouri, the territorial system and the territorial period of government is a weird, unremarkable event. You might learn about it in high school. probably gets as much space in a textbook as the Dust Bowl. And as we were learning at lunch in that wonderful talk, that's a real loss to all of us. So the question is, what can we learn from this? Because territorial rule in Oklahoma was 17 years. But territorial rule was the norm in the United States for over a century and a half. We're not just talking about 32 states, we're also talking about a long period of time. As I said, it is territorial government that will establish this and will extend into the 20th century. If you don't believe me, let me read something to you. I want to read a passage to you. Quote, "Under the auspices of the American government, you may confidently rely upon the security of your liberty, your property, and the religion of your choice. In a word, that your interest will be among the principal cares of the United States." Now, this is a small passage from a very long speech by William C.C. Claiborne. And he was delivering this speech in New Orleans on December 20th, 1803. It was part of a very elaborate ceremony marking the transfer of Louisiana to the United States. And Claiborne was saying, here is what it will mean to be part of the United States, and then said, territorial government will look after this for you and define your future. That's one passage. I want to read you another one. And I'm going to start reading. You probably won't know what it's from. Eventually you'll know what it's from. It's going to sound very similar to what Claiborne said. "We will respect your great religious institutions. We will help you build a peaceful and representative government that protects the rights of all citizens. And then we will leave." Don't know what it is yet? "Iraq will go forward as a unified, independent, and sovereign nation that has regained a respected place in the world." Now, this was a speech by George W. Bush, and he delivered it in March 2003, almost exactly 2 centuries after Claiborne. And the two speeches are almost identical in their promises of representative government, religious liberty, and eventually independent self-government. Now, what accounts for this? What explains that connection? Well, I want to explain that connection today and use it as a way to talk first about the 18th and 19th centuries, and then to talk about the 20th century. Indeed, I want to use Oklahoma statehood itself really as the pivot to transition to not from this longer story of the United States and of the frontiers of the United States in the 18th and 19th century, to see how those precedents would eventually relate to the United States in a global context in the 20th and now in the 21st centuries. So let me explain to you how the politics of frontiers was rooted in profound questions of governance on Western frontiers. I'm going to begin my story in the late 18th century. And before I do that, I should tell you, the frontiers I discuss will move. Because many of the speakers today have talked about the West, and I'm going to talk about the West, but I got several Wests. Because frontiers, as many of you know, this concept of a frontier is that a frontier is both a place and a process. And indeed, it's a term that many historians are deeply uncomfortable with because it brings with it a lot of baggage, and a lot of really bad baggage. So I'm going to use the term today, and I'm going to use it as a way of talking about different Western regions: the Trans-Appalachian West, the Trans-Mississippi West, eventually the far West in the United States. And the roots of these notions of territorial government begin in concerns about the Trans-Appalachian West. That's where it was located, and it was an attempt to answer a big question: what should the United States do with Western land? And indeed, this was one of the most complex, most difficult, one of the most bedeviling questions of the 1780s. Because a number of states had large areas of Western land, and they had ceded them to the government operating under the Articles of Confederation, because they found they could not govern them. But what was the Congress under the Articles supposed to do? You may find yourself wondering about this. You thought, well, I read about the Articles of Confederation, and I read that they didn't work, and then I stopped caring about them. Well, there was a Congress under the Articles, and they had to deal with this problem. And there was no easy solution, because the only solution they had was one they believed did not work. They looked to European empires, which had dealt with land this way. There was an imperial center, and then there was a colonial periphery. And colonies were supposed to be unequal to the imperial center. And Americans said, yeah, we know how this story ends. It ends with colonies declaring their independence, and they fight wars, and they go their own way. So what will the United States do? Well, eventually Americans conclude they need some way to explode old definitions of empire. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote about the United States as an empire of liberty, sometimes called it an empire for liberty, but this was really because he wanted to get rid of empires altogether. The resolution came in the summer of 1787, and that's a summer you may know about. It's, of course, the summer of the Constitution. And the solution to Western land is developed in exactly the same place at the very moment that the Constitutional Convention's meeting in Philadelphia. The Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, is hammering out the Northwest Ordinance. Now, we're west of the land covered by the Northwest Ordinance. It was governing an area that includes much of what is now the sort of eastern Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And the principles of the Northwest Ordinance was that the land there would be divided over time under provisions that would allow for its eventual admission to the United States as states on equal terms. But before that moment happened, it would be the central government's responsibility to govern that land, to govern those territories, to select the leadership, to choose the officials, to make certain things work. It is hard for us now to recapture how truly revolutionary and truly radical this was. As I've said, all of the models that U.S. citizens could look to were these European imperial models, which said that as governments expanded and acquired land, that land would become colonies, and it would be subordinate in perpetuity. Instead, the United States took principles that they had applied to individuals and applied them to states. Individuals should be individual citizens, should be independent in making their decisions. Individuals should be able to make decisions on their own, and individuals should be equal before the law. They said, let's apply that to states and say that new states will be independent, they will be self-governing, but they will be connected to the United States, and they will be equal to other states. Throughout the 1780s and 90s, the principles applied first to the Northwest Territory were also applied to create Kentucky, Tennessee, the Mississippi Territory. And indeed, by the end of the 1790s, this system seemed to be working. But the other lesson that Americans were learning from this is that governing Western land, governing what they called frontier land, not the Disney place, not frontier land, but governing frontier lands was extremely difficult and extremely costly. And indeed, by the end of the 1790s, governing Western territories was the single greatest domestic policy demand on the federal government, and it consumed the largest amount of federal resources. It meant there needed to be territorial appointees who could be paid. It meant that the United States Army, which was the largest single budget item in the U.S. budget at that time, was stationed principally in the West. So let me repeat this situation. Western residents want independence and autonomy. They don't want the federal government telling them what to do, but they also want the federal government to provide them with a lot of resources. Does this sound familiar? This is a long Western tradition, and it does indeed date back to the 1780s and 90s, because the residents of these territories get restive and they want to expedite the move to statehood. But until they're ready for statehood, they want the federal government to deliver these resources. Now, as I've said, the system seems to be working from the perspective of federal leaders, meaning first in New York and then in Philadelphia. The territorial system works. But then in the first half of the 19th century, this system is pushed to its limit, and it's really transformed. And I want to emphasize this as a way to think about how the West and how areas of contact, frontiers on the West, changed over time, because this system had to be completely reinvented in the 19th century in response to three new, profoundly difficult questions, profoundly difficult challenges: the expanding territorial claims of the United States, the federal government's commitment to racial supremacy, and the mounting dispute over slavery. Now, that might sound like a contradiction in terms. How can the federal government be committed to racial supremacy at the same time that there's a federal government that's going to resist Southern secession? Trust me, this will make sense. Expansion's easier to make sense because you've seen those maps. You all saw them in your high school textbooks, where the boundaries of the United States expand to the west. Well, expansion during the 19th century was a profoundly messy process. The United States underwent repeated moments of territorial expansion, and they included but weren't limited to several examples. The Louisiana Purchase, which was in 1803, doubled the size of the United States, brought some benefits, acquired Missouri through that. I like the Louisiana Purchase. Acquired most of Oklahoma through that. I like the Louisiana Purchase. There are other moments of smaller land acquisition, the Florida Cession in 1819, large acquisitions like that after the Mexican War in 1848. And they came about for different reasons, different causes. The Louisiana Purchase came very much as a surprise. Sorry, folks, I say this to folks in Missouri, sorry, the United States didn't pursue that land. France really imposed it on the U.S. Americans later came to celebrate it. Florida was achieved through diplomatic means, and of course the Southwest was acquired through warfare. But in all of these, the territorial system had to be adapted to these places. And I want to emphasize not just to places, but to people. And it's at this moment that the territorial system became a form of naturalization. And I really want to emphasize that to all of us here, all of us from the North American interior, because my talk today is in many ways about the interior. And yet, often when we encounter history, it's coastal. Again, I'm from Philadelphia. You know, I'm not that far removed in my childhood from that, New Yorker cover where it's New York and everything is collapsed clear to the Pacific. And when we hear about naturalization, it's a coastal story. It's a story of immigrants who came across the Atlantic or across the Pacific. It's my ancestors who came from Germany and Russia, or other people's ancestors who came from Ireland, as we heard today, or from China or Japan or from Vietnam. It's very much a coastal, ocean-going story. But throughout the 19th century, there were large numbers of people who found themselves becoming Americans without moving a step. They didn't move, the United States moved. And suddenly the territorial system of government had to govern people who looked definitively foreign and somehow convert them to American. Now, who are these people? Who am I talking about here? Here are a few examples. Missouri, where I flew from yesterday, in 1803, St. Louis, the majority of the population was a Francophone population whose ancestors came from Canada, the Caribbean, a small number from France. There were loyalists who had fled the United States after the Revolution and moved to the Gulf Coast, only to find their land acquired by the United States in 1810. There were, of course, a large number of Hispanic residents living in Florida in the 1820s. They're Indians of numerous descriptions, numerous ways they describe themselves throughout these lands. And here's the problem. In each of these cases, federal policymakers saw these people who looked definitively foreign as a profound challenge. And the territorial system was going to have to double as a system for nationalizing people, for naturalizing them. The first concern was for white residents, because many of the treaties that ceded land promised that these people would become citizens. Members of Congress, members of the administration said, local white residents will be unloyal, or they're incapable of self-government. And again, worse still is the fact these people have to become citizens. Well, what's striking to me is in most of these places that are acquired by the United States, local residents actually found much to enjoy in U.S. citizenship. That although some of them resisted, I'm more struck by the fact that they did not resist. And they did it because they saw the territorial system in much the same way that Americans had. As colonial subjects, they had complained about imperial neglect. As colonial subjects, they had said, we can't choose our own leaders. They're chosen for us. They're imposed on us. We want to be able to choose our own leaders. And then they look at the territorial system, which says, yes, the federal government will choose our leaders for a while, but when we become states, we can govern ourselves. We can choose our own governor. We can send representatives to Congress. We can be represented there. The other reason why many white residents in these new territories found common cause with the United States is because they knew that the federal leadership was committed to racial supremacy. And indeed, a vital purpose of the territorial system was to put the muscle of the federal government behind this objective. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, it took various forms. During the 19th century, the federal government saw it as its mission to force Indians to acknowledge federal sovereignty, to coerce Indians into surrendering land that was coveted by white settlers, to establish the conditions for white slaveholders to be able to carry slavery into the West. All of these would have been impossible without the federal government. It, of course, to some degree involves the work of settlers themselves, but the federal government is in large part what helps to make this happen. And again, you're wondering, wait a minute. Kastor said this would be a story of racial supremacy, but it would also be a story of the Civil War and the end of slavery. Well, these territories, of course, help to accelerate the sectional conflict. Enter Missouri, my beloved Missouri, which I teach about to my students as saying, you should all be very proud of Missouri, really helped set us on the road to the Civil War. Congratulations to all of you. Because the Missouri crisis is the first time that Americans really argue loudly about whether a territory should enter the Union as a slave state or a free state. And this is then repeated over and over and over as a result of these moments of territorial acquisition. It becomes most heated in the 1840s and 50s. And the federal government, the federal leadership, wants to preserve the Union. But the territorial system and the debates over its future are tearing the nation apart. And that's why I think it makes so much sense to me that Abraham Lincoln is such a staunch Unionist coming out of Illinois, which has its own early history. As a young man, he would have heard stories about how people in Illinois, how settlers in Illinois, governed under the Northwest Ordinance, had eventually created a state of their own that was independent, self-governing, but also very closely connected to the Union. And it was a free state because the Northwest Ordinance had prohibited slavery. Abraham Lincoln in the 1840s and 50s would very much repeat this, his staunch belief in union, but his staunch belief in the individual independence of settlers, and his great fear that white slaveholders would wield inordinate economic power, inordinate political power, and that that power would undermine the independence of individual settlers like those around Lincoln when he had grown up. By the time the United States, not only by the time of the Civil War, but by the time the United States went to war with Mexico in the 1840s, there was also a big change at work during this period. As I've emphasized, until the Civil War, the territorial system seemed to be working. And I think the territorial system goes a long way towards explaining why Americans, who in the 1780s and 90s had been deeply worried about expansion, had by the 1840s become quite comfortable with it. Could say that expansion was not only viable, but necessary. We often hear about manifest destiny as a concept referring to how Americans saw their manifest destiny taking form in the West. But they could only imagine that because they could imagine that the United States could actually govern this place and could govern it effectively. And the territorial system seemed to be indicating that that might be a way to do so. The successes of the territorial system would make it a really easy model to go for, a very easy template to use. In the century that would follow, it began actually during Reconstruction, immediately after the Civil War. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the federal government faces this question: how can it rehabilitate the Confederacy? What's the template going to be? They actually look to the territorial system. The notion that the United States would appoint federal officials to directly supervise, and in the fullness of time, these places could once again become independent and self-governing. In addition, in the same way that the Civil War and Reconstruction create the moment to adapt the territorial system, the Civil War actually enables the territorial system to achieve many of its goals. In 1865, the U.S. claimed territory clear to the Pacific, but I would argue it didn't really govern much of that territory. Much of the territory in the West was still governed by Indians. So how is the United States going to change that? Well, it took the Army created by the Civil War to change that. Not just in its size and its organizational capacity, but an army under the leadership of Westerners, of Grant as the commanding general, under William Tecumseh Sherman, who took command in the West, men who not only knew how to fight a war, but men who had both been raised in Ohio and grew up with a certain notion of frontier history, of Western history. William Tecumseh Sherman had grown up with stories about how, of course, how settlers had conquered the West, but it had been very much with the assistance of the federal government. And it is a federal army that Sherman commanded in the far West. So let's stop for a moment before I go overseas. Because in so many ways, the Oklahoma Territory was the logical extension of this system. First and foremost, because it was like other territories. Again, federally governed. The governor chosen by the president, nominated for requiring advice and consent of the Senate. The plan was that this place would eventually acquire statehood. And when Oklahoma became a state, residents responded much as they had in other territories. First of all, celebrating the United States, celebrating the capacity of the U.S. to expand, but at the same time, I was reading through some of the newspapers at the moment that Oklahoma became a state, and there are a number of these editorials saying, now all these federal officials, they can just be thrown out, and we can pick our own leadership. And of course, who's one of the first victims of that? Boyd himself. Selected by a Republican territorial governor, and then evicted as president of the university after statehood. Something else I found that was really striking to me was an article from the Daily Oklahoman on November 17th, 1907, announcing statehood. And there's a headline that reads, quote, "Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory are symbolically wed." Yeah. And of course, before then, the land that is now Oklahoma had been divided in half between land set aside for white settlers and land for Indians. Well, Indians had been forced to move there. It included the Osage Indians, who had been the most powerful Indians in Missouri, the state that I'm from. And in some ways, Indian territory and federal territory had always been wed, because the federal system sought to superimpose U.S. sovereignty onto Indian land, until such time as white settlers applied enough pressure for the government to force Indians to move to other lands. Statehood in Oklahoma was also supposed to mean an end to lawlessness, with local residents now fully capable of governing themselves. Well, those transitions were never easy. I want to read you a few other headlines. I love these. So here are the other headlines from the same day the Daily Oklahoman was announcing statehood. Saloon duel, cause of death. Hold on. Chauffeur is fatally cut during fight. Enid firebug caught while making blaze. And this, the last, my favorite, battle with guns. 2 dead. So some things did not change in the West. But what was striking is the newspaper then has to say, all of these problems will go away now that we are a state. Local residents again saying the federal government has a responsibility to help create this place, but now we should govern it ourselves. Now, between the creation of the Oklahoma Territory in 1890 and Oklahoma statehood in 1897, there is a moment when all of these principles are slowly being changed and applied on a global stage. Because in 1898, only 8 years after the creation of the Oklahoma Territory, the U.S. went to war with Spain. And in the process, acquired a host of new territories, and more importantly, I would emphasize, new peoples. Because what I've been emphasizing is the way that with the acquisition of land, the bigger challenge is what do you do with people who live there? And what do those people living there want? The places I'm talking about now are the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba. And the United States also had annexed Hawaii in 1896. Well, what should the U.S. do with these places? And there's an immediate scramble to apply the territorial system there. partly for reasons of geographic distance, but also because the white leadership of the United States sort of can't imagine the non-white populations of these places truly governing themselves. The United States says, whoa, 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 there's no plan for statehood. There's some initial discussion of eventual independence for the Philippines, but what I found really interesting is that in September 1907, right before Oklahoma statehood, William Jennings Bryan comes to Oklahoma. Now, he's out here stomping to be president of the United States. So he's going to tell the Oklahomans what he wants. And he says, you know, the administration, they're talking about the administration of Teddy Roosevelt, they're talking about making the Philippines independent and self-governing. How can they make them independent and self-governing without making you self-governing first? And this will remain one of the great challenges in the first decades of the 20th century. The U.S. holds this territory, very much wants to, because federal leaders see these territories as an immensely valuable resource, but they can't imagine making them states and can't imagine them letting them go their own way. And this suggests the real limitations of this system. It's only in 1935 that the United States begins making plans for Philippine independence. In the meantime, Puerto Rico continues to occupy this kind of nebulous status. And it would have been interesting to have known what would have happened about plans for Philippine independence. But we don't know, because World War II turns it on its head. And at the end of World War II, the U.S. government says, well, the Philippines had been a loyal ally during the Japanese occupation. They'd had a resistance. They'd fought alongside us. And the U.S. expedites independence for the Philippines. But the lessons of the territorial system, which are so problematic for the U.S. in these extraterritorial jurisdictions, are much easier with the zones of occupation after the war. Because let's look at Germany, Japan, Italy after World War II. What is the U.S. approach? And it's an approach that the U.S. really forces onto its allies. Says, what we will do in Germany and Japan and in Italy is we will govern these places. We will train them in self-government, we will rehabilitate them, and in the fullness of time, they will become independent once again. But even though they are independent, they will be allied with us. And this is a hard sell to Britain and to France, partly because of how they had suffered during the war, but also their imperial histories really left no comparison for this. They're trying to hold on to their empires. In the decades that followed, the United States not only would follow through on this, but would also hold this in contrast to the Soviet Union, and saying where the United States had created an independent West Germany that was nonetheless connected to the United States, where the United States had helped to foster a democratic Japan that was connected to the United States by alliance. The Soviet Union had created East Germany merely as a satellite, as a colony of a Soviet empire. Now, this may seem pretty far afield from the politics of territorial expansion in the 19th century, but the systems of government that the United States uses, not just the high-minded constitutionalism, but the bureaucratic structures, form this very direct continuity over time. I think it goes a long way towards explaining the connections between those two speeches I used to begin my talk. William C.C. Claiborne in 1803, George W. Bush in 2003. Because I really doubt George W. Bush was reading the letter books of William C.C. Claiborne. You agree with me on this? Yeah. No, I mean, look, I've read the letter books of William C.C. Claiborne, and man, they're boring. But, so I really doubt that Bush or any of his advisors were reading that, but that's my point, they didn't have to. These principles of how the United States approaches governing both foreign land and foreign peoples are so deeply embedded in our national culture that they didn't have to. These are systems that are literally as old as the Republic. Both Claiborne and Bush were attempting to make sense of political principles that Americans hold dear. Independence and unity, expanding American power, but how to do that in a way that doesn't smack of imperial rule? Because think of the criticisms leveled against George W. Bush, that he's behaving as an imperialist. In a United States where Americans want to be able to claim that ours is a nation, is a republic, is a democracy, but is not an empire. And indeed, that was my goal today, in many ways to support the mission of this teach-in, which has just been a really wonderful experience for me, and also of the university in general, but again, to get to the lower half of that, the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage, and to have you think about how constitutional structures in the United States exist in rather elastic terms, outside of just the wording of the Constitution, the relation between Congress, the executive, and the judiciary. That throughout its long history, the United States has had to accommodate the acquisition of territory, the acquisition of people, and to find some way of working that out in a way that didn't make it seem like the United States was an empire. How to do that, how to face that challenge, emerged from traditions that were forged in the West, on the frontiers of the Union, in places like Oklahoma, and in ways that live with us to this day. So I want to close on that note. I want to thank you once again for having me here today, and I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and I'd like to thank you especially for telling a version of history that places Oklahoma right at the center of all history, that confirms the version that I was told growing up. It's wonderful to hear that it's true. We have Crimson Clubbers with microphones on the edges. Great. So if you raise your hand if you have a question, one of them will come up to you, and we have time for a handful of questions to Professor Kastor. See one here? Okay.
Yes, if I could just ask you to comment from the time of the end of the acquisition through war, Mexican-American War, of the territories of the Southwest, basically from 1848 until the admission of Arizona and New Mexico. That was a long period. Could you comment why those two territories took so long in contrast to the others that came in through that same war?
So the question was to account for the very long period between acquisition after the Mexican War and statehood. Well, so let's think about several places acquired at the time of the Mexican War. So the first one's California, which enters immediately as a state. And I think we learned this morning why California would have the muscle to do that. In constitutional terms, for every one of these places, there's a population threshold. So one thing that determines when a territory becomes a state is the population. Has it crossed that population threshold? Texas actually was able to negotiate. It's not acquired during the war, but it joins the Union soon after the Mexican War. It's basically able to negotiate its entrance to the United States on its own terms. So usually people say, well, simply, has it crossed the population threshold? Many territories have long periods of territorial rule, not just for reasons of population, but because for some reason or another, there is either local opposition or usually opposition in Washington to accelerating the process of shift to territorial rule and to statehood. The state that I find, if it's okay, I just want to add another one to this. I actually find Hawaii far and away the most interesting example of this. Because when it's acquired by the United States, it's abundantly clear that if it's going to become a state, it would have been the first state to enter the Union where the vast majority of the population isn't white. And this is at the same time in the late 19th century that there's, in many areas, a commitment to racial supremacy. And it's not surprising to me that when Hawaii enters the Union in 1959, it basically takes that much time for the United States political system to accommodate itself to that reality. And so it's this combination of factors: population threshold, local political mobilization, and sometimes external political acceptance that determines the timeline through which one territory after another enters the Union. It's a long answer to what was, I think, a very good question. Other questions?
no territory, no size function for becoming a state. That we can see that Hawaii and Alaska both became states and
Same year.
different in size. What about Puerto Rico, American Virgin Islands, and American Samoa?
Exactly.
Midway.
It's a terrific question. So the first point is, size has not been a principal determination of whether territories become states. Throughout the 19th century, in this federal effort to carve up the frontiers, and that's very much the way it's approached, that the idea is that this land is to be carved up. If there are people living there who have their own existing boundaries, particularly Indian political boundaries, those need to go by the wayside. There is some effort in the lower 48 to try to make the states similar in size to their neighbors. And that's why if you clump them together, they look that way. But the question of why Puerto Rico, and I think you said American Samoa, why they don't become states, there's several reasons for this. The first claim is they're non-contiguous. Okay, well, that goes by the wayside when you think about Hawaii. The long-running claim is that one of the requirements was that a place demonstrate evidence of a capability for self-government, and with both of those places, the claim from many critics has been that even though local residents are capable of self-government, they're not capable of economic self-sufficiency. And that's the argument that's been made most often in opposition to statehood for either of those two places.
Also, a requirement for statehood is a referendum by the people in the territory.
Well, I was going to say, Puerto Rico ends up rejecting it.
It hadn't passed in Puerto Rico. And so they feel some independence. Now, I'll tell you something about Texas. It was actually the heart-rendering speech by Andrew Jackson before the Congress that got Texas in the states.
It's a very good point.
You mentioned, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, you mentioned about racial supremacy and the promotion of federal government. And you mentioned about the immigrants that came to the United States, but you alluded to mention the African American as far as indentured slavery, indentured servant, and also slavery, but also too, moving forward through the Civil War, and you mentioned the United States Army, and from that progression, the Buffalo Soldier, in dealing with the development of Oklahoma, in protecting the citizens of the United States and the progression of moving west. Can you speak a little bit about how that, in reference to a book that just came out from Edward Baptist, The Half Not Told, and how the United States became a world market based on cotton and slavery?
Okay. So there's a lot in that question. So I'm going to try. Okay, so I am going to subdivide it like the federal government did in the West. So you had asked a more general question about African Americans. You then asked particularly about Buffalo Soldiers, about which I know the least. And then you asked about Ed Baptist's book, which is a book I read recently, and absolutely fascinating book. So African Americans in general, when we think about the role of the federal government in this, which is very much how I was trying to frame this, how we can understand territorial growth, the creation of territories in the West, in its relation to the Constitution and American expansion. So the federal government makes clear that part of its mandate is to make the Southwest safe for slavery, that the federal leadership, first in Mississippi and in Alabama, later in Louisiana, in Florida, and every one of these, the territorial leadership says, one of our absolute responsibilities is to make sure these are places where slavery is stable, where there will not be a slave revolt, and where a slave system can grow. And it's not surprising that the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, which happened right outside New Orleans in 1811, happens on one of these territorial peripheries where federal control seems weak. So that's, a point I mentioned briefly, but I just wanted to elaborate on. The other really interesting thing is that when federal officials arrive in Western territories, they encounter not just enslaved African Americans, but free people of color. And one of the first things they say, they sort of look around, they look in these places, and they say, whoa, 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 whoa. Under the French, under the Spanish, free people of color enjoy political and economic opportunities that would be unacceptable in the existing United States. And they quickly try to set in motion legal reforms that will take away a lot of those rights and opportunities. And a lot of white residents in those territories agree. That's what many of them want that as well. And my goal in saying this isn't just to sort of condemn what the U.S. is doing in these places, sort of self-condemning, but rather, again, to suggest that this remains this big challenge, that we often hear about expansion and frontiers as a process of acquiring land. Well, it's also a process of acquiring people. And one of the first things the U.S. government does is say who can be a citizen and who cannot. And for the white residents of these Western territories who were foreigners, their path to citizenship is quick. And they see all these benefits. They achieve equality. That is real for them. And their states are equal. But at the same time, people who don't fit the kind of designation of whiteness are boxed out of these privileges and rights and opportunities of citizenship. That's the first point. Buffalo Soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers are part of this process. And the only reason I'm not going into more details, I think if I do, I won't stop, because I find them so interesting. But I would suggest seeing them as part of a federal military that is a necessary part of the process of making expansion work. As I've said, governing the West consumes more federal resources during the 19th century than any other domestic policy challenge other than the Civil War. And Buffalo Soldiers are part of that. Ed Baptist's book, I would simply say to all of you, read Ed Baptist's book. But his principal interest is in how the U.S. economy grew as a result of the Southern plantation system, and I agree with him. And in many ways, this territorial expansion is what helps to fuel that growth, but it requires a system that can preserve these places under federal rule. And the move from territory to state is how the U.S. goes about doing that. It was a complicated answer to what you were asking, a very straightforward question. I took it in a number of directions. I hope that answers your question.
One last question.
One last question. Oh, it's Lindsay.
Yeah. I have just sort of a question of origins. Since you raised the Constitution, the constitutional authority for this whole program of federal governance, transition to statehood, is the Territories Clause, and which says that the federal Congress can make rules to regulate the territories of the United States. In the infamous Dred Scott decision, Roger Taney said that clause was intended by the framers only to empower Congress to regulate the Northwest Territory, and that all the rest of the stuff was outside the contemplation of the framers, as was presumably the acquisition of land. So I'm wondering if the origin of this, and it's a brilliant formulation, but if it is traceable to the framers of the Constitution, or if this is something that maybe the Jeffersonians came up with in order to justify the planned governance of the Louisiana Territory, and then it sort of rolled on from there. So where does this come from, I guess? It's my question of origin.
Your first question is about, so you're asking about Taney and about that particular issue. And what's striking to me is, Dred Scott decision becomes so important, but what he says about the role of the federal government in the territories, the government kind of ignores. I mean, I'm struck by how the Dred Scott decision doesn't really register a blip in terms of how territories are created and governed, except to light a fire on the national debate about how territories can be created in terms of whether they're going to be free or slave states. So that's the way I would explain that. This is a system that is invented by the Jeffersonians. It is reinvented, and it's very much imagined in terms of this trans-Appalachian West, a land that's supposed to be going to the Mississippi River, and it's principally concerned about how to govern land where the assumption is Anglo-American white settlers will slowly move to this land. And this is how you create a temporary government while they are arriving and while Indian sovereignty is being extinguished. And then it has to be completely reformulated again and again and again, first for territories west of the Mississippi. And then, as I was suggesting, it's kind of adapted for how the U.S. approaches overseas governing, not just after World War II, but also, as I was implicitly saying, in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. And like the Constitution itself, it's appropriated by each generation and argued about loudly. And that is as close as I'm going to go to any point about constitutional interpretation, because that is a minefield. This is a question from a professor in the law school, and I am not getting in trouble with him or with any of you. And that was the last question, so I'm free and clear. Thank you very much.
Wow, he has talked about this, the Constitution. He's put Oklahoma at the center of the story. He made fun of lawyers and Texas. That's a great talk. Thank you very much, Peter.